Hi, everybody. My name is Neda Tanasowski, and I'm professor and chair of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome you to a book celebration for one of my dearest friends and colleagues, Christine Hong, and to celebrate her new book, which is called A Violent Peace, Race, US Militarism, and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific. For those of you who don't know Christine, she is Associate Professor of Literature and Associate Professor and Director of Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. And one of the reasons why I'm especially excited to celebrate Christine and her accomplishment today is that Christine is a person who helps so many students and colleagues across campus and beyond, reading drafts, helping them organize, working alongside students to found the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program. And Christine is one of the most modest and selfless people, and so it's truly wonderful to be able to talk about her work today and to spotlight her. So alongside me are Professors Alyosha Goldstein and Mila Huja, who will be offering commentary on A Violent Peace. So for those of you who don't know, we have this incredible tradition in critical race and ethnic studies of celebrating when one of our faculty members publishes a book. So the way the event is gonna go is Christine will speak first about her book. And then Professor Goldstein will offer some remarks, followed by Neil. And I would ask the audience to please put all questions in the Q&A. After the presentation part of the event, we'll be taking audience questions. I am sad that we can't be celebrating Christine in person, and I know it won't be quite the same having this discussion over the Q&A function, but as I already threatened Christine, we will be celebrating her in person soon enough. And at least the virtual nature of this event got us to rope Alyosha into our conversation and celebration, which I'm really excited about. Before we begin, I would just also like to thank the Literature Department, the Feminist Studies Department, and also the Center for Racial Justice for co-sponsoring this event. And with that, I will turn things over to you, Christine.
Neda, thank you so much for organizing this book celebration. I appreciate it enormously. And also deep thanks go to Taylor Amesley, to Shantae Larkins, Lisa Seppel, Danny Geralt for organizing today's event. I also want to say that, many people who are taking part in the Zoom event, both at Santa Cruz and beyond, and people who are not able to, just a group of cherished friends supported me as I labored to finish this book. And I also, it was a very stressful process as it was ongoing. I was really lucky to have Robin Kelly and Chandan Reddy as my reviewers. And today to have Alyosha Goldstein and Neil Huja who are willing to offer comments. Thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone for joining to celebrate the fact that at long last, my first book has been published. I'm very, very moved. And so I debated whether I should read from the book itself, but I decided instead to speak a little bit about the origins of the book and what I hoped this book might clarify about US militarism. And forgive me, I'm just going to show a few images from a PowerPoint slide, and there aren't a lot, so I won't be shifting between them very rapidly, so just bear with the static images. Let me see if I can get this. Okay. Let me see. Oh, whoops. Sorry, my daughter just entered. Hunter, hi. Hunter, okay. Hunter, okay. Hunter, okay. Sorry. Just a moment. Hunter, Mohe. Okay, sorry, just Hunter. Okay, just give me a second. I'm really sorry to do this. Oh, thanks, Hunter. Okay. Let me just start from, let me see. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, that was my daughter, Hunter, coming in. So I just wanted to state that I first went to South Korea in the mid 1990s. I had never been before. I've since been to both Koreas. And about half a decade prior to my going to South Korea, students in these democracy protests set fire to the USIA building in Seoul. And when I went to Korea, there were regular protests, demonstrations that were happening. And at these protests, there were anti-American slogans. There were entire lines. You can see them somewhat in this image of military police, and they're just so many. The presence of military police was so intense at all of these protests. There was routinely tear gas, and this happened on a regular basis. And at that point, I was struggling to make sense during this time about the palpable ubiquity of war power that structured South Korean society, and in particular, the depth to which US militarism had penetrated social life. And so it was really at this moment, and perhaps even earlier, that there were seeds that were planted, questions that were planted that ended up informing my research. One of the things that was so striking to me, that was a part of the South Korean landscape were camp towns. And these military camp towns, or these ghettos around US military bases, had a twilight economy. And the twilight economy included Korean sex work. And it was a sort of economy that was infused by American GI dollars. There was a proliferation of bars, brothels, fast food joints, massage parlors. South Koreans during this historical window would try to learn English by watching AFKN, which is a US military broadcasting network. You would see GIs on the subway. And so there's just a sort of, this was such a, it was so striking to me. It raised questions for me. And there were regular protests during this time, as I mentioned. And I wanted to say something about this. When I came to grad school at UC Berkeley, I was struck by the fact that there wasn't all that much work on US militarism other than through security studies and to some degree some work that was within the social sciences. But this particular book really draws from a political educational trajectory, and that's specific to anti-imperialist and therefore anti-war struggles. And some of the most, I just note here too, that some of the most compelling thinkers on US militarism have been involved in various struggles for self-determination. Here I just mentioned the Anishinaabe activist Winona LaDuke, Chamorro activist Julian Aguan, Filipino anti-based activist scholar Roland Simbulan, the Solidarity for Peace and Reunification in Korea activist scholar Kang Jong-gu, as well as many other people that I've had the privilege to work alongside in Korea peace work. But this book also draws from a legacy of Black anti-fascism, which I contend offers one of the most powerful structural critiques and cognitive mappings of US war and police power. So in the course of doing my research, I examined consolidation of Black anti-fascism, even though this arguably stretches back to the betrayal of Black Reconstruction as a phenomenon that was galvanized by far more than a push for the integration of the Jim Crow US military during World War II. And so really thinking about World War II as a critical moment. And one of the questions that I pose in this book is, how do we understand US military imperialism? And what kinds of, how do we define this? And I think that we have to think about the transformation. Sorry, let me see if I can get this. We have to think about the transformation of the United States during World War II into a total war state. So prior to the emergence of Homeland Security, and so Homeland Security was the most thoroughgoing reorganization of the federal government um, uh, after the creation, the Cold War, early Cold War creation of the national security state. But how do we understand World War II as a very crucial moment for things that we naturalize as being sort of contemporary to our current moment? And I think that we have to understand that World War II fundamentally remapped the continental expanse of the United States as what was referred to as the zone of the interior. And so let me see, I think I have my slides slightly out of sequence, but let me just go, whoops, yeah, I think I did. Okay, I think I did not include this, but sorry about that. But beyond, we can think about, of course, the Western Defense Command, which some of you might be familiar with, but the Western Defense Command, which was so associated with the infamous rounding up of ethnic Japanese from the Western United States into US concentration camps, was not the be-all, end-all, or the total story of how the United States implemented domestic or internal security measures during World War II. During this particular time, the total war framing of the United States as what FDR called an arsenal of democracy entailed a very broad based infrastructural securitized transformation of the continental United States. So corresponding to national territory that wasn't necessarily formally included in theaters of operation, the zone of the interior was home to overlapping military and domestic counterintelligence campaigns. It served as a testing ground for new technologies of surveillance, policing, and social control that was aimed at routing out fifth column activity in stateside armed forces, as well as in the civilian population. And so what I want to say here is that the FBI, which was just one of many intelligence agencies, which included, as I mentioned, military intelligence, that trained its sights on domestic populations as possible national security threats, produced a thoroughgoing report called Racial Conditions in the United States, or RACON, during World War II. And this was not declassified until Robert Hill, a historian in Black Studies at UCLA, got it declassified about 3.5 decades after, actually even more, maybe almost 4 decades after it was produced. And what RACON did, Racial Conditions in the United States, it was a surveillance initiative that focused in particular on Black civil rights organizations, Asian, principally Japanese groups and figures, and of course, communists. And so what my book looks at is in particular racial counterintelligence or racial intelligence. And there are files under this rubric in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. and to understand how racial counterintelligence and racial intelligence were critical dimensions of imperialist war. And so this book draws a line of continuity between World War II era total war counterintelligence efforts, not just to COINTELPRO, but also two US hot wars in Asia throughout the Cold War. And so against those ways in which World War II is retrieved as a social equalizer, and I would argue this is a potent, very potent mystification of the nature of that war. My book asks the question, how do we understand race under the sign of war? And so here, this book offers a twinned genealogical account of US war and police power on the one hand, and post-war multiculturalism on the other, that originates in an untold tale of mid-century US fascism. So, I want to say something here about Rosie the Riveter. And, I would say that Rosie the Riveter, who's often celebrated as a feminist icon, is rarely understood as a total war icon. And, in the wake of World War II, part of the kind of liberal retrieval of World War II as the sort of good fight against fascism, which obscures the fact that the Black radical critique of the United States during World War II was that it was precisely not just a racist, a racist state and society, but that it was also fascist. And so, one of the kinds of ways in which you can see a kind of trajectory from this kind of liberal retrieval of World War II as this kind of origin point for civil rights expansion is the fact that Truman issued, just on the heels of World War II, the desegregation of the US military. Oh, oh. Honey? Okay. I'm so sorry. Oh, Hunter. Oh. Okay. For posterity. Okay. So, okay. So I wanted to speak here about Barack Obama. And in the early 1950s, there were government-issued reports that declared that the Korean War represented a breakthrough on the color front. And, there was a report that described it also as a successful racial revolution, a door of opportunity to Negroes, and it was referred to a living example of democracy in action that, quote, changed the complexion, unquote, of the armed forces, placing the United States military at the vanguard of civil rights reform. And in 2013, Barack Obama went to the Korean War Memorial on the National Mall, and this was a memorial that was erected in the early post-Cold War period, belatedly. But he went there and he made a speech on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the armistice agreement, the Korean War Armistice Agreement. And this was an armistice agreement. So it was signed by the United States, by China, and by North Korea. And it called for, within basically 3 months' time, a return of those powers to the diplomatic table to hammer out a permanent peace agreement. That has never happened. And indeed, quite the opposite. In Korea, South Korea, it's the case that today, not only is the Korean War not over, but also it's the case that South Korea still hosts approximately 100 US military installations. According to both mutual defense agreements as well, a series of them, the United States can use at whim and at will any South Korean base. So it doesn't matter if it's actually nominated as a South Korean base or port. And the United States regularly rehearses war exercises that are the largest in the world. And these war exercises rehearse the decapitation of North Korea's leadership and regime change, as well as they have practice runs dropping dummy nuclear munitions on the Korean Peninsula. And so on the 60th anniversary of the signing of the Korean War Armistice Agreement, and this was a time when I too was on the National Mall, that I was involved in a protest outside of this area. What happened was Barack Obama really called attention to how the Korean War reordered US racial relations along democratizing lines, how the Korean War in effect blurred the color line. And so you could think about the statement before you and the sort of liberalism of the sort of emphatic liberalism of this statement. You know, basically he's stating, you know, giving a sort of account of the how the Korean War's military multiculturalism led the way to civil rights reforms domestically, and how together as one, you know, a range of different minority soldiers alongside white soldiers paved the way for there to be transformation at home. And these statues are actually about 7 feet tall. They're made of steel. And if you just look at them, and when you're there, you cannot detect ethnicity. But if you go to the National Parks website, there is a very careful enumeration of the racial or ethnic breakdown of these different statues. But I think that these statues perform what Barack Obama's statement does too, which is a certain kind of militarized colorblindness. I wanted to say also that one thing that historians have noted, people like Daniel Widener, a historian down at UC San Diego, he says that the Korean War gave rise to the belief that the United States military, despite being the primary purveyors of organized violence on the planet today, represents the most meritocratic, socially equal, and ultimately progressive institution in American society. During that same speech, Barack Obama also stated, and it was called Heroes Remembered, that US allies and enemies have to know that the ultimate lesson of the Korean War is that the United States will maintain the strongest military the world has ever known, bar none, always. And so, you know, the question is, how do we deal with, on the one hand, the sort of liberalism of this militarized multiculturalism, and on the other hand, the intense illiberalism of this statement? And I think that we have to recall that the calculation behind desegregation as federal policy was, in the first instance, the US war machine's efficiency. So on the cusp of the Korean War, Truman's Fahey Committee, which cast a backwards glance on World War II, argued, and this is a quotation, that the nation's manpower cannot be used with maximum efficiency unless the armed services offer to all men in uniform equal opportunity to discover and exploit their capabilities. And this is the end of the quotation. So if construed by some as civil rights progress, post-war military desegregation signaled something much more sinister afoot, namely the institutionalization of a permanent war posture against enemies abroad and at home. And so one of the questions that my book asks is, how do we understand the political form of US militarism? I argue that US militarism has to be understood as race within militarized form. And so this is from the cover of my book, and it's artwork done by a South Korean artist, Nanyang Lee, called We Are Here to Stop You. And here she was looking at the Kangjong struggle in Jeju against a sort of US-backed militarization of this area. And to understand that this kind of the political form of US militarism, which I'm saying is race within militarized form, is one way that you could understand US democratization efforts abroad. But it also has another history. And so this book examines how the US concentration camp during World War II, the bombed out cityscapes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the front lines of US wars of aggression in Asia, and the US military uniform here in the trans-war years during and after World War II, the Cold War era, and reaching forward into the post 9/11 period, how these kinds of arenas were coded as sites of democratic opportunity for racialized subjects. And my book contends that insofar as race within militarized form represented an avenue of incorporation or inclusion, we have to understand two dynamics alongside each other. The geopolitical dynamics of sub-imperial incorporation. You know, we think about George W. Bush calling for a coalition of the willing. But if we backdate this to the Cold War, you can see how sub-imperial incorporation, more flags, etc., the UN banner with regard to the Cold War, military occupation and mutual defense alignment, which were framed as regional pathways to development, have to be theorized in conjunction with the biopolitical dynamics of desegregation, assimilation, and racial mobility that have typically been construed as equalizing social measures that were vital to democratic progress in the United States. I argue that both modes of integration were central to securing US dominion in Cold War Asia and the Pacific. And I just wanted to say a few other things just before closing, which is that this post-war portrait of the US, the integrated US war machine as a social equalizer obscures the Black radical critique of its function as a fascistic generator of racial unfreedom. And so here I would argue that Black anti-fascism, both during World War II and throughout the Cold War period, it served as a particularly revelatory lens with regard to the centrality of warfare to the political economy of the United States. So far from hailing Jim Crow in uniform, and this is Claudia Jones's phrase, as a sign of democratic progress, my book examines how Black anti-fascist critique perceived the lurking fascist dimensions of race within militarized form, foreseeing the prospect of militarized transracial complicity in a fascist agenda of unfreedom, including imperialist war. And so this book necessarily frames its analysis of Jim Crow in the military and defense industries, not in narrowly domestic terms, but against the imperialism of US war power. And it's here that we might, in retrieving minor war writings by major Black writers, understand the fascistic origins of what we today label multiculturalism. So in an unpublished 1940 Federal Writers Project essay, The Negro and the War, Ralph Ellison argued that the World War II seduction or war seduction stemmed from its offering a non-economic basis upon which Negroes could participate in national life. So in other words, mobilization against a common enemy was cynically used, in Ellison's words, as a device for unifying the diverse classes of the fascist state. So I just want to end here and yield to the comments, and just to thank you again for gathering to celebrate the publication of this book. I'm very moved and grateful. And yeah, thank you also for this sort of bright moment. This has been a very hard season for my family and me, and I really appreciate your gathering all together. Thank you.
Right, so I think I'm up first commenting, and so I just want to begin by thanking Netta Tanowski and the Critical Race and Ethnic Studies program for inviting me to speak as part of this event celebrating Christine's magnificent book, Violent Peace. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here and be in conversation with you all. So I'm just gonna be pretty brief, but I wanna start with a few just general comments about the book. I think to just speak to the ways in which it is such a really crucial, important intervention at this moment. And in a way, it's a book that in certain respects actually really defies easy summary, because I think there's so many different important work going on in the analysis that Christine provides. But I'll just gesture towards that a little bit, some of that sort of the larger significance, and then focus on one specific thread of analysis that I think stands out to me in particular, which I think is really just one among many. I mean, the book really has so many really compelling elements that are woven together in really amazing ways. So I'll just start by saying A Violent Peace is a truly remarkable accomplishment and an urgently needed piece of scholarship. I think the book will be read across many disciplines, not only because it's beautifully written, persuasively argued, and deeply researched scholarly contribution, but because it is a strikingly capacious work that elegantly weaves into its discerning analysis the foundational violence and racial terror directed towards African Americans, the ongoing colonization and dispossession of indigenous peoples in what is presently called the United States, and the US imperial militarism through which the US seeks to constitute a particular version of the Asia-Pacific world. So it's really an ambitious and field-defining work. I want to underscore that. You know, as much as we can sort of speak to the kind of primary forms of analysis it offers, it does so many other things as well. So A Violent Peace is that rare book that combines clarity and force of argument with a broad and innovative engagement with multiple fields, histories, and geopolitics. This is also a study of profound significance for academics and activists alike, both a compelling and critical theorization of the historical and racialized making of the US total and permanent war state, and an analysis with direct utility for anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggle today. So I think I'm going to speak to some of the reasons why I think it does those things. And one way I think of focusing on one detail that actually addresses that, that conveys the profound significance this book has for scholarship and the challenges of this specific moment, is the way in which militarism is itself constitutive, or US militarism specifically, is constitutive in its role as constituting the racialized division and sometimes blurring of these divisions between foreign and domestic, the divisions between home and abroad. The way in which the book so astutely traces out both how these divisions are made, the ways in which they're blurred, all in particular and strategic ways, I think, is one of the, for me, most striking aspects of the book. And so I think it's hard not to speak about it also in the specific moment that we're in right now. This is a week where the so-called peaceful transfer of power has been heralded by so many. And the new president of the United States declared that, quote, democracy has prevailed. Hong's arguments about the multidimensionality of fascism and how its US formations have been predicated on disavowal and the categorical ascription of World War II era Germany Italy, and Japan as those sites of fascism, always over there, always somewhere else, is really absolutely essential to understanding our current conjuncture. Hong's analysis of fascism and its lethal articulation with overtly liberal forms of governance, racial liberalism, military multiculturalism, and uneven global economies of racial capitalism is exactly on point for grappling with the relationship of the Trump years to the past of the Obama administration, to the kind of recently so-called unity that is being pursued by the Biden administration. Hong's analysis offers a long view on how such calls for unity served as the basis for military multiculturalism, linked structurally to, as she was just discussing, this kind of fascist conceptions of war unity, a unity that ultimately continues to preserve the predatory imperatives of racial capitalism and the status quo of heteropatriarchal white supremacy. So in the epilogue to A Violent Peace, Hong notes how former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in her 2018 book, Fascism, A Warning, projects the fascist threat outwards, either as embodied by a series of international dictators such as Mussolini or Hitler, or supposedly, and this is really the kind of driving force between Albright's book, an un-American extremism instigated and personified by Trump. Hong shows how Albright's framing, quote, fails to indict an imperial system geared overtly and covertly for perpetual warfare that has donned domestic liberal trappings, end quote. After all, this is the same arch-imperialist Madeleine Albright who, as Hong writes, notoriously justified the death of 500,000 Iraqi children as an acceptable price of US sanctions. And it's really at this moment, I think, sort of the ways in which we see across the board this effort to kind of ascribe and render the Trump years as somehow an aberration, as somehow a radical break that's now resolved, that we see the books such as of Christine's that really draws out how those continuities remain constitutive, how the forms of militarism and total war across different Republican and Democratic administrations, such that, you know, when Joe Biden triumphantly tweeted in November, "America is back," this was a declaration that Yamada Taylor asked in a retweet, "Is that a threat?" The "America is back" that he tweeted really speaks to the ways in which there's a kind of a recuperation in the current moment that disavows this sort of underlying and constitutive forms of fascism of the US itself, right? This is something that varies in intensity and visibility, but it's not something that is simply ascribable to this sort of moment that we've now resolved through this so-called process of electoral democracy. And indeed, in regard to Albright's unflagging American exceptionalism, Hong argues that instead, quote, "the story of race in US militarized form requires us to contend with the total war origins of and military imperial impetus behind early Cold War era integrationist ideology." So this book provides us with such a compelling genealogy of that. And not only that, Hong, in fact, tells the indispensable counterstory both of Black anti-fascism, as she was speaking, but also the anti-imperial view of the nuclear war machine from Japan and from the Marshall Islands. Speaks to the Huk Rebellion in the Philippines and Carlos Bolasan's novels, All the Conspirators and The Cry and the Dedication, and US militarism's racially queer genealogy in Asia and the Pacific. This is a book that brings all of these things to bear in this very forceful analysis, so relevant to our current moment. So Hong traces across movement, across the constructed divide of the so-called foreign and domestic, really in a way showing that continuity, a continuity of this post-war moment as the sort of flashpoint that links and provides us a way of understanding that post 9/11 moment in a wholly different way. She shows how, for example, in her chapter on Ralph Ellison during World War II, concerns within the US military for the problem that the military named as the problem of Black morale, served as a means of intensified surveillance and policing of Black soldiers, ultimately constructing African Americans more broadly as a threatening enemy within, and establishing a racialized counterinsurgent apparatus that continues to this day and was further galvanized in that kind of post 9/11 policing. This is a really, really important story that I think has not been fully brought to bear, that this book actually showcases. At the same time, she points to the structural connections that are highlighted between the, quote, murderous effects of the lyncher and the atom, quote unquote, in the 1951 Civil Rights Congress petition, We Seek Genocide, or We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people, which was submitted by Paul Robeson and William Patterson. In another context, Hong reads Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony for its explication of similar interconnections. She writes, quote, in a novel that dwells on the links between uranium mining in the four corners of the US Southwest to the dismembered corpses and atomic heat flash outlines in Japan, the nodes of the nuclear Pacific brutally converge, end quote. Hong underscores how throughout settler colonialism treats indigenous peoples and lands as valued for their disposability and ungrievable devastation was ultimately intertwined with its realm of nuclear experimentation and ruin in the Pacific. So these and many other examples reveal the dynamic interplay through which the logic of the foreign and domestic serve the racialized distinctions that make operable the exercise of US perpetual and total war. At the moment when Biden has doubled down on US antagonism against Venezuela, we're going back exactly to the Trump era policies on that, recognizing, I mean, it's crazy, and further embraced the US commitment to the perpetual war on terror and military multiculturalism, Hong's A Violent Peace provides readers with a means of critically understanding this context in new ways. And so these are just a couple of many, many crucial arguments this book's made that I just wanted to draw out and speak to. And I'll stop there, but I just want to thank Christine for this book. This is, I'm looking forward to teaching it. It's a book that bears many, many reads. I think you can kind of keep returning to it. It's a book that keeps on giving readers new understandings. So thank you so much for this.
Alyosha, thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Alyosha, and thanks so much, Christine. I'm so glad that I get to share some thoughts about this book, but also to just thank you for everything that you've done for critical race and ethnic studies and for our community at Santa Cruz. Anyone who has worked with, sat beside, taken a class with Christine has witnessed the kind of passion and urgency with which Christine asks students and all of us to confront the kind of crisis issues that circulate in our discussions of race. And A Violent Peace lays out in book form a sense of that urgency in confronting not only kind of the present crisis moment that we inhabit, but also giving a kind of map for how to, historically place ourselves within it. And it's a book that insists that you kind of sit with the trouble of being, of the artists and activists that had to confront the challenge of both speaking about the historical injustices of the United States and the ways that they were projected and have been projected across the late World War II and post and Cold War contexts. So, in addition to all of the kind of specific contexts and themes that Alyosha brought up, I want to emphasize the way in which the book forces a reader to become intimate with the situation of not being able to easily plot a way forward through those tensions. And when you begin in chapter 1, reading Christine's account of Ralph Ellison attempting and abandoning to write something about fascism in the World War II, in the late years of World War II, you get a sense of both the immediacy of the challenge and the ways in which the total war state created a situation in which it wasn't easy to write one's way into a position of resistance. When Christine proposed that the Center for Racial Justice's theme for this year be no liberation in isolation, if I had known that she was going to write this book in this form at that moment when she proposed that in the meeting, I would have had a greater understanding of what that meant, because you get a sense of the challenges encountered by Marshallese people who have not been told that they're being subjected to a nuclear experiment, attempting to figure out what's going on and to create solidarities, even though they're not allowed freedom of travel. You get a sense of what happens when concentration camps in the United States for Japanese people, where artists, photographers are not allowed to represent it. What happens when a certain artist is picked by the government and allowed by mainstream journalists to air illustrations, how that can't simply be read as a transparent form of resistance, but has to be understood within a longer genealogy of how the United States has managed to transform what was the most devastating act of mass killing at the end of World War II, the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, into a narrative of progress, inclusion, and indeed democratization. This book asks us to think about the art of democratization. And that specific aspect of the argument is crucial to understanding the intervention that Christine makes that distinguishes this study from other studies that look at the important links between police power domestically and militarized power abroad. Part of the crucial link here is that in the art of democratization, there's not a simple break that can be made where we say there was a kind of fascistic, military idealized form of art that happened before, and then at the end of the war, it was replaced by something more progressive, more democratic. The way in which state actors and the military were involved in promoting and propagandizing a transition to democracy is one that muddled the ground for artists and activists. And this is a story that until Christine's book has not been told across this entire archive, linking all of the disparate sites Christine looks at. So I'm gonna share a passage from the book that explains how even in the immediate aftermath of the nuclear holocaust, the art of democratization is infused with a kind of ambivalence that militates against us understanding the ongoing fascism of United States militarism. So if I can find that in my notes here really quickly. The imperial war machine's anti-humanism and profound racial violence sentimentalized the human element. And for the inhabitants of Asia and the Pacific, the post-war Pax Americana, the American military peace that settled the region in the wake of Japan's defeat, would introduce an anti-communist necropolitical order in which unfreedom would be presented as freedom, democratization as democracy, and militarism as the basis of life itself. Now, the specific, actually that wasn't, I'm sorry, that wasn't the quote that I was aiming for. Just give me a second, my poorly organized notes here. Here we go, from page 21. In contrast to the post-atrocity aesthetics that assume a decisive historical break from the genocidal histories that spawn them, the art of democratization, although marked as post-war, never arrives at the time of liberation, much less democracy. In this regard, it must be contrasted to the body of Holocaust art and letters that Adorno called lyric poetry after Auschwitz, and Weissel described as the literature of testimony. If the staggering human ruin consequent to Nazism gave rise to a cultural archive positing a clear post-war rupture, both aesthetically and politically from fascism, the Pax Americana cultural archive in Asia and the Pacific entails grappling with shadowy geopolitical transition and troubling continuity. The corpus of double-fronted counterinsurgent war calls for contextualization within a geopolitical context informed by the stark absence or failure of official mechanisms of justice and the suspension of decolonization. Despite this insistence of sticking with the tension and ambivalence of art that responds to the fascistic pull of both the domestic racial order and the totalizing violence exercised by the military across multiple regions and geographic zones, Christine's book insists that there's work to be done, and that in the work that specific groups of activists who challenged the war, who expanded forms of petition, testimony, and redress, that there could nonetheless be some sense of the connections across imperial geographies. And none of this is as apparent in the chapter that Christine includes on counterinsurgency and the novels of Carlos Bulosan, where you see that indeed there are documents presented that are declassified showing the surveillance of Bulosan as he traverses both US and Philippines contexts of insurgency and attempts to kind of counter the US attempt to recolonize after the war with Japan. Finally, I wanted to have us think with the final chapter of the book, in which Christine both reflects on the don't ask, don't tell policy and the way that Dan Choi, who was the most visible public spokesperson arguing for gay inclusion in the military, links us in a very kind of hard to track way to a history of the Korean War, and specifically the ways in which a certain kind of mascot performance was central to US representations of that war. And this for me was one of the most difficult parts of the book to read, and it was also one of the most the one where I felt like I just couldn't wait to talk to Christine about it, in part because there's such an intimate connection to the material, and it's not necessarily stated up front, but Christine includes photos that GIs took of children who were taken up as war mascots and who were also in some ways laboring for American servicemen, right? Doing kind of labor within the base culture of deployed US soldiers. So these young children who had been captured, who were workers, and who were also in a sense part of the spectacle of the war and its purported savior and democratizing potentials, are pictured in these eroticized images. And these are not publicly circulated or archived images. These are images that Christine has found. Or I don't know, actually, maybe you'll tell us more about them. But there was a kind of intimacy in this chapter, both in the forms of violence and the layering of race, gender, animality in these images and narratives of the Korean mobilization, that totally refuses any attempt at suggesting that militarization and occupation are humanizing events. Nonetheless, Christine sticks with the difficult theoretical track and asks what it means that these forms of representation of the Korean War mascot engage with the body, engage with something that would otherwise be called dehumanization, but the tropes of animality that can't be refused, in part because those are the very points at which there could be solidarities created. For example, where she gives the examples of in Toni Morrison's literature of these very animalizing scenes of post-slavery life in the United States for African Americans. So I think that for me, this kind of critical intimacy that exists throughout this book is something that Christine has always modeled in our work in ethnic studies. And I think that the book leaves us with so much to grapple with, but also a model for how to ethically engage with histories that can't just be treated as raw materials, but that have something to do with both the experiences of people who are distant from us at the moment, and that enliven and enrich our understanding of necropolitical orders that we experience in our own lives today. So that's where I'm going to leave my comments for now, but I hope we can discuss more and ask questions.
Thank you so much, Neil.
Thank you so much, Alyosha and Neil, for your wonderful comments and Christine's brilliant book. I wanted to encourage everybody in the audience to put any questions that you have in the Q&A, and I'll make sure to ask Christine the questions. But I thought maybe we could start, Christine, if you had any responses to Alyosha and Neil's commentary, or Alyosha and Neil, if you had questions that you wanted to raise for Christine.
Well, could I pick up on that question about the archives and your relationship to them? Because in that chapter in particular, there was like a sense that you had really grappled in a physical sense with the materials, these photographs. You had also taken some photographs of war museums that I found to be really fascinating. And when grad students were discussing it in a seminar earlier today, just the richness of these materials and the way that you carefully kind of unfurl them into this longer analysis was done so beautifully. But there's also, you get a sense that there's an intimacy and a connection that you have personally behind them that we don't necessarily get to read about in a direct way.
Yeah, thank you for that, Neil. You know, it's trying to do research on the biopolitics of US militarism by using, for example, the finding aid at the National Archives is next to impossible, because the National Archives, the very system of classification, follows military logic. So it's by unit. And so if you want to trace something like military mascots during the Korean War, it's impossible to, unless you have prior knowledge of some sort. You're using newspaper articles that speak about specific mascots and you know the unit designation. It's very difficult to uncover that kind of information. And so there's the problem of the archive. It's also the case that, I mean, with regard to the Korean War, it was the last US interventionist war in which human mascotry was tacitly permitted, but that also meant that there were animal mascots, and they sort of existed side by side. And it was also a war in which there were other non-normative sort of forms of inclusion, including of racialized soldiers. So you had sort of quote unquote cannon fodder, mascots, and animal and human, all in a kind of militarized milieu. And one thing that I have also grappled with is the fact that my father has spoken recently, in recent months, about his experience as a youth during the Korean War. And he has those memories, and he has there's stark images that are associated with what he experienced during that time, just trying to survive. And I think it's very striking that for the most part, Koreans within the diaspora do not have, they don't have a material index of some kind, that we don't have the photographs and what have you that document this particular time and its extraordinary devastation. Instead, you had the US military that had its, formal photographers, but then you had Kodak brownies, portable cameras. And so, observers described the portable camera as much a part of GI uniforms as, the uniform itself. And so here you have all of these. I mean, like, if this were a kind of third cinema approach, it's like the laborers who have the sort of means of documentation, but it's embedded with imperial power. So they're all embedded. So it's not as though those images, which offer a kind of double consciousness perspective of power, looking at the Korean landscape, at Korean life, animal and and human, it's not as though those are the missing images. They're so perspectively shaded, and yet they're the images that I have been collecting, and the way that I have been collecting. So for about 2 decades, I realized that on eBay, families of deceased vets were selling these images. And there's just album after album. I mean, earlier more so, and just, collections of photos. And oftentimes it's almost impossible to source who took them, the context. But there's just a plethora of images out there. And in my very sizable collection of these albums and photos, sprinkled throughout are images of mascots in camp life situations. And you're right that there's an intimacy to those images, in no small part because the mascots did reproductive labor relative to the US military itself. The line between houseboy and mascots could also be girls, but the line was very, very thin. And there's also a thin line between girl mascots and sexual labor. And so, the eroticism, and Sharon Holland's notion of the erotic as the glue for racial orders is palpable in those images.
I also just think about the connection between the earlier chapter on the sort of memento photos in I forget the fellow's name, the atomic bomb victim #1 with the shop, and the photographs with his back facing the camera. Like again, the sort of materiality of those and intimacy really at the same time as sort of the kind of spectacle of it as well. So there's sort of a tension between an intimacy of his body and the sort of the scarring on his back to the sort of spectacle and the kind of the violence of the photograph in that way, reenacting it. I mean, that seems also, there's the resonance across those two different moments in really striking ways.
Yeah, I so appreciate that too. So there's a figure who at the Red Cross Hospital in Hiroshima, Kikawa Kiyoshi, happened to be labeled atomic bomb victim #1. So there are photos with him with like that kind of designation because, the hibakusha were numbered 1, 2, 3, just, by happenstance, he happened to be #1. And then he sets up, as I describe in the book, an atomic bomb casualty shop, like echoing the title of the US commission, formal commission that examined the effects of radiation on the human body. And, in post-war Hiroshima, I think that it's so interesting how GIs would frequent this shop. They would buy these, photo albums that were tied with ribbon. I have some of them. And he would take bold black marker and he'd sign it, no more Hiroshimas, like atomic bomb victim #1, Kikawa Kiyoshi, it's all on there. And the GIs would oftentimes, to authenticate their experience with Hiroshima, take photos with him, but not always with him facing, sometimes with his back showing. And in theory, you can imagine that these images then get tucked into photo albums, they get taken home, they get circulated around. And what I argue in that chapter is that we have to understand a proprietary US claim in ruin, and to understand that in the nuclear Pacific, unlike some of the sort of Patrick Wolf sort of orthodoxies around settler colonialism to, that you destroy to replace, you destroy, but the destruction is so enormous that there's no capacity for settler life, So this sort of destruction that's perceived to be over there then sort of redounds to the benefit of life. Like, how do you survive nuclear apocalypse? Well, let's look at the Marshallese, and redounds to the benefit of life that matters, life that doesn't matter, and life that matters over here, Yeah.
Christine, we have some questions coming in. So from Stefan Young, I was wondering if you could speak about your thinking on the relationship between democratization and citizenship. I was struck by what I saw as an arc in the book where post-war democratization in the first 3 chapters seems quite aligned with some of the promise, bribe of US citizenship and its associated privileges, whereas in the subsequent chapters, citizenship seems increasingly unavailable as a hermeneutic for understanding trans-Pacific democratization?
Stefan, thank you for that question. It's such an apt question. You know, what I look at, I mean, it's not as though some type of citizenship isn't possible, but I really appreciated what Alyosha was saying, which is that US militarism both blurs the divide between here and over there, as well as reproduces the sort of fortified gate. And it's certainly the case that a certain type of incorporation is symbolically possible, and that largely is presented as giving a kind of humanitarian face to US militarism. So you can think about these sort of Operation Baby Lifts of mixed race and, you know, Asian orphans from Korea and Japan throughout the Cold War period, in theory slated for naturalization, but that of course depends upon the adoptive parents following through with the paperwork. You know, on the US end, you could think about the GI War Brides Act as a way, a sort of citizenship gateway that links, you know, camp towns and, you know, for camp town formations within Asia and the Pacific to some sort of citizenship status within the United States. And so there's all these ways in which militarism, you know, sort of aligns itself with the possibility of citizenship. But with regard to democratization as a kind of project, of a sort of gradualist project toward a spectrum of sub-imperial junior partners, it's not always that citizenship is held out. It's, you know, democratization, how would I, you know, it's not that it's instead the sort of mode of incorporation is what I was discussing during my very brief presentation. I presented in a sort of condensed way. It's thinking about dynamics of sub-imperial incorporation. And so, and you know, but it's interesting because I'm reflecting on your question now. When you think about Los Angeles circa 1992 and the fact that there were fleets of ethnographers that went to South Central LA looking at Korean immigrant entrepreneurs. One fact that was buried there, but I think is very telling, you know, like one of the questions was, why in the world are all these Korean immigrant entrepreneurs on top of like these South Central swap meets bearing, you know, like serious weaponry, you know, and like, what's the deal? And, you know, like buried in some of the ethnographic accounts is the fact that a disproportionate number of them served as part of South Koreans' reinforcement of US troops in Vietnam. So, yeah, I don't know if this actually answers your question, but I'm thinking about the latter part of that question and just welcome a further conversation with you.
We have a question from Jennifer Gonzalez. So she writes, "This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. The topic also raises questions about how the idea of fascism circulates in various cultural forms in the US. Would you care to comment on the way photography has operated in the past 4 years, either on the side of white supremacy or anti-fascism, to support or critique domestic militarism?"
I mean, Jennifer, I would love to hear your answer to that question. I really mean that because I would love to hear your take, you know, and it's such a provocative framing, but I wonder if you can answer that, if we have the capacity to unmute you so you can actually speak to that.
I guess there's the chat function.
But isn't it possible that what we can do, and I think I can do this right now, is allowed to talk. So I'm going to do that right now. Oh, Here we go. Jennifer, I'm trying to allow to talk. Taylor, do you know how to do this? I'm pushing allow to talk. I think that because I'm not the co-host, I don't have this capacity. Oh, okay. Jennifer, would you mind unmuting yourself and speaking?
Maybe while we're figuring it out, Christine, would you mind taking Kasturi's question?
Yes.
Kasturi says, in terms of visual representations, can you tell us more about the artist behind the cover image? Is she involved in other recovery projects?
So I actually know very little about the artist behind the work other than through shared spaces. I went to Gangjeong, in Jeju when, basically it's, just such a heartbreaking situation. The Gangjeong villagers, live in one of the most beautiful places in this world, and as is the case with the culture of Jeju, women in that village have historically been sea divers, and they farm in a very sustainable way the ocean. And there was Gangjeong is a place where lava meets the sea, and the rock formations, the geologic formations, the softness of the rock bed that once existed there, Kurumvi, it was astounding to behold. And what happened, and this is a sort of cursed, it's during an earlier, the Nongmyeon, a liberal administration in South Korea, what happened was that president wanted to create blue water forces so that South Korea could have military autonomy from the United States, which maintains command control over the South Korean military during times of war, and then left office only to be succeeded by a neoconservative. And neoconservatives have always aligned so well with so-called like liberals in the White House. And what ended up happening was that instead of this being a sort of move toward Korean sovereignty from US militarism, instead, because the United States can use any military installation or any port of call, like in South Korea, there was a strong push for the construction of a massive naval base at Gangjeong. And what happened was, the Gangjeong people, the people who are indigenous to that land, the villagers came out in protest, and there was an international campaign against this. There were environmental studies that indicated the kinds of devastation that this would wreak. And what happened was, this is all part and parcel of Barack Obama's Pacific pivot, where he was going to move away. So Barack Obama did not view the war on terror as his signature foreign policy achievement. He viewed, he born in Hawaii, or what, growing up in Hawaii, at least, I don't even remember. I'm not trying to do a birther conspiracy. I don't remember like where he was born, but I know he went to Punahou, at some point. So that was definitely high school. But he had as his sort of, he cast his gaze on the Pacific and really wanted to reallocate a majority of US military resources away from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And the goal was the common Cold War goal, in the post 9/11 period of encircling China at the expense of decolonizing struggles within the region, and anti-base efforts within the region. And so the Kangjang villagers, even though the sort of, the argument that was made was, oh, you have to have the naval base there because that would enable there to be a kind of containment of North Korea. It was a bogus argument because there wasn't even the capacity to intercept nuclear missiles from that particular geostrategic location. And so Nanyang Lee was someone who was also involved in this, Korean and international struggle, the solidarity movement, to, just not have the base that was built be built. And her image to me just demonstrates so much the spectrum of people who gathered in solidarity against that incursion.
Christine, we have a question from Madhvi Murthy, who says, congratulations, I can't wait to read and engage with your book. I'm wondering if the genealogies of race in US militarism form, I'm sorry if I've misused the evocative phrase concept that you set up, enable us to think about the diverse frameworks through which race and militarism are fundamentally entangled, such that the mainlining of white nationalism in the Trump era occurs in the context of no new wars, and the Obama era multiculturalism is linked with military interventions.
Yeah, I mean, Madhvi, you raised such an interesting point. It's like, people who do Korea peace work, it's not that they were, credulous in their view of Trump, but people were very surprised to see, Trump, who, states that he was a critic of the, war on terror, in Iraq, and was against US involvement in the Middle East, also adopted a really curious line specifically with regard to North Korea. And, but of course was confronted by the obstinacy and intractability of the national security establishment. And it's not as though he had any sort of clear vision for peace or any sort of commitment to that kind of project, but he did, at least rhetorically, whereas like one liberal administration after another, echoing George W. Bush, who nominated North Korea as part of the axis of evil, as I said, liberal presidents in the United States align themselves fundamentally with neocons throughout the region. And, whenever it came to these kinds of gargantuan war exercises, within the region, the way that these were always described by Chuck Hagel and others was, it's not provocative, it's just business as usual. And describing them as provocative was always held to be like North Korea's line toward war exercises, or, various other actors within the region. But then Trump tweeted, I don't know if it's a tweet, but at least they are provocative, and that sort of like rupture of the kind of, national security establishment orthodoxy was so curious. So, yeah, I think just an observation based upon your comment, Madhvi.
I think that was the last question we had, except Amy Bong, who's congratulating you, Christine.
Oh, thank you, Amy.
And thanking you also, Neela Nalyosha, and saying that she's taking away dynamics of sub-imperial incorporation, and says that phrase does a lot of work. Thanks, Amy. Neela Nalyosha, did you have follow-up questions or thoughts on any of the questions that were raised?
I really appreciated what you were saying on the intervention you were making in the nuclearization chapter, because, you know, when we think about kind of narratives of how settler colonialism has historically operated, it was really fascinating to read your particular point in the chapter 4 of the book that focused on how property works differently here, and how there was a specific kind of, you know, trustee framework that was established for the Marshall Islands that allowed for it to proceed as a kind of experimental site where trusteeship meant property not just in land but in life writ large. And it's such an important counterexample to narratives that assume that, you know, following Locke's description, you know, it would be improvement that would be the condition for granting colonial property. So there's a whole other kind of juridical framework that is invented for a kind of experimentation at this moment in time. And the field of ecology is based on this kind of experimentation originating at that time. So there's a whole host of fields that need to grapple with this particular history of what colonial property can look like. And I thought you articulated that beautifully.
Oh, thanks. You know, I thank you, Neil. You know, I opened the book thinking about how we understand through a focus on US militarism, the structural linkages between the war target and the racial profile. You know, and in both instances, it's a conflation of racialized humanity with terrain, you know. And in that particular Nuclear Pacific chapter, I look at how we have to think through um, not just the sort of area target, you know, as, you know, periodize it simply within the framework of war, but within so-called peacetime, to understand how what was described as a proving ground, which are always indigenous lands, how the proving ground, which was incorporated, including in the case of the Marshall Islands, under the Department of the Interior, you know, much as, you know, indigenous nations, you know, are also, you know, sort of supervised in this way, how we have to understand the sort of linkages between these different sites.
And I think in so many ways, what you're speaking to also gives us really useful way to actually push back against the sort of overly generalized phrasing of Wolf, the destroy to replace, because actually, you know, the sort of the language of national sacrifice zones, you know, as you write about in the book, the sort of nuclear economies of uranium mining, but you could even extend it sort of beyond sort of direct militarism to thinking about, like, you know, the devastation in the Arctic, all kinds of the ways in which extractive economies actually, they're not simply about placing or nativizing white settler populations. They're also about creating these kind of, you know, what you refer to in Tracy Boyle's work about wastelanding, but also to just this sort of, that the value is in the way in which these places can be devastated with impunity, can be, and those include people too, right? So I think that actually the link that Neil so eloquently spoke to in the book, I think we see actually providing a way to kind of build further understanding of the kind of dynamics of US imperial militarism that troubles the sort of neat sequestering of a settler colonial project as distinct from these larger imperial ventures. So thank you for that.
Oh, yeah. You know, you're reminding me of something, and it's also something that Neil was saying about, you know, the Harshawalia sort of expression, no solidarity in isolation, which is that actually militarism as a kind of network structure. So if there's racial complicity as a sort of fundamental feature of US militarism, it's also the case that a cognitive mapping of racial capitalism which uncovers these linkages, also provides the grounds for imagining solidarity.
We don't have any more questions. And Christine, I think that's such a beautiful way to end. If we were in person, we would now raise a glass of champagne and eat cake together. But instead, I'm just thank you for writing this brilliant book that I know we're all going to be rereading and teaching. And thank you for being such an amazing friend and colleague. And all I have is a glass of water to raise to you. But here's to you, Christine. And soon we will be celebrating you in person. Alyosha, thank you so much for joining our CREST community from New Mexico for the evening. And Neil, thank you for your comments. Thanks, Taylor. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for coming to help us celebrate Christine.
I echo Nita's thanks wholeheartedly. Alyosha and Neil, thank you so much for dwelling with this book. I'm so appreciative. Thank you to the rest of you who have engaged with it. Nita, thank you for organizing. Taylor, Shantae, Lisa, Danny, thank you for handling all of the details of this event. And yeah, thank you everyone for being willing to have a discussion about militarism on a Friday night. We appreciate it.